Down in the depths of a submarine, there's no sunrise to mark time. There's no wind, no sky, just silence, steel, and focus. That's where today's guest, Navy officer William Spears, learned what pressure really feels like. Every sound matters, every decision has a weight to it, and the only thing that keeps chaos in check is your own discipline. From that experience came his book, Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy, built on the same principles that guided ancient thinkers for centuries. William talks about how those ideas still hold up in today's world, where mental strain and constant noise from social media and other places can wear down even the strongest people. He shares how applying a clear, grounded mindset can quiet the inner turbulence that comes with leadership, family, and the weight of responsibility. But before we get into this episode, I want to take a moment to raise awareness for something that's important to our community, the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Foundation. This organization is working to build a permanent national memorial in Washington, D.C. to honor the service members, families, and civilians who were impacted by the global war on terrorism. This memorial will serve as both a tribute to those who served and as a way to ensure that their sacrifices are recognized and remembered for generations to come. If you'd like to learn more or find out how you can support their mission, visit gwatmemorialfoundation.org. Now let's get into today's episode. Hey, William, welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Hey, Scott, really appreciate it. Hey, before we get going, let me say to your audience that I am active duty military, which means that it's important that I say that anything that I do say here is just in my own capacity as an individual. It doesn't reflect an official position of the U.S. government or Navy or anything like that. If I don't say that, then I'll inevitably say some dumb thing, and it'll be like, the Navy says that Nickelback sucks, and when we all know that the Navy really loves Nickelback. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, so we got that underway there. So like, you got no problem with, you're just speaking your mind now. You can say whatever you want, right?
Yeah. Now I can just say anything, right?
Yeah. Now you can sound like a complete fool if you want.
Yeah. I said with all due respect. So I'm covered.
Yeah. So obviously that covers everything. So.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. And thanks for, coming on the show. I know, sometimes while you're still in the service, sometimes there's some issues with that, but I don't think we're going to be talking about anything too controversial here, but I'm glad you got that out of the way. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. You serve on a nuclear submarine. Tell us a little bit about that for anyone who maybe is not familiar with that world and what that's all about.
Okay, sure. So I'm a career submarine officer. I started off as an enlisted guy back, joined the Navy right out of high school, quickly applied to any kind of commissioning program I could get into, and the Naval Academy was the first thing that called back, and then came into the submarine force from there. And I have served on, I've spent plenty of time on different subs. I've at this point served through full tours on 3 different submarines, 2 fast attack submarines as a, division officer. And then as a department head, I was the weapons officer of an attack submarine. And then I most recently served as the executive officer or second in command of a ballistic missile submarine. And so that's kind of been my career. And then, in the Navy rotation, you'll spend a few years assigned to a ship that goes in and out. It spends some time in port and it spends some time at sea. And then whenever you rotate off the ship, you'll do a job on shore duty for a little while and kind of recover and recharge batteries and do some office job. And so at this moment, that office job is I'm assigned to the Pentagon. I do financial management stuff and look at spreadsheets of how expensive ships are and, help inform decisions of what ships we should buy and everything. Of course, I tell everyone we want submarines, but
sure, of course. I mean, who wouldn't want that? I mean,
yeah.
You can have a whole fleet of submarines and no one would know it if they're all under the water. So.
That's all we need is just submarines. Just cancel everything else.
Everything else. I mean, aircraft carriers. Yeah, we don't need those either.
Nah, just submarines.
It's probably a good thing that you put that little disclaimer at the beginning of this episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, but yeah, I know that's all tongue in cheek, but it's cool that you kind of can share some of that because I know some folks who have been in the Navy, they serve on various ships and stuff, but submarines, I gotta imagine is a completely different world because you're basically in a tube. There's no windows. There's no. I want to step outside for some fresh air and get
Yeah, we've got a
you know
periscope. You can look out that.
right exactly.
Sometimes.
So that's got to be that's got to be tough. I mean, there's no sunrise or sunset to let you know when the day starts or when the day ends, and you just kind of basically have to rely on your clocks and kind of go from there, right? I mean,
Yeah,
there's
the watch rotation is what
yeah.
keeps you on time. So I get asked a lot is, hey, do you ever get claustrophobic or do you have people that lose it due to being claustrophobic? And what I can say is, occasionally you do have people who don't adapt, and you gotta figure out what to do with them, and you got to get them off the ship whenever you get a chance. But most of the time, if someone fails to adapt, it is not due to claustrophobia. It's just due to the stress level, and that kind of describes the hey, what's it like to be on a submarine? It's very, very busy. It doesn't matter if you are a senior officer or if you're a junior sailor, whatever it is, you've got a lot to do. And it doesn't matter how long you've been on the submarine, because just if you're a junior guy, you've got a stack of books and qualifications and just stuff that you have to learn. There's this constant pressure to learn the systems and learn the ship so that you can pull your weight.
Mhm.
And then as you move up in seniority, you've just got more and more responsibility. And it doesn't matter if you're enlisted or an officer, you've got more and more responsibility. And just every day, as soon as you wake up, you're like, man, I got a lot to do.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you don't have a lot of time to think about, like, man, I'd really like to go outside. It's more like, man, I'm behind. I need to catch up on all this work I got to do. And that
Sure.
that kind of is, as a coping mechanism, it keeps you busy. It keeps you from, you don't have time to ruminate on all the places you'd rather be.
Sure.
It's just more like I got work to do. So
Yeah.
that
Cool.
that has been true at every level of my experience on
Yeah.
every ship.
Yeah, I'm sure it's nice when you finally get back to shore and you can kind of get out, stretch your legs. You're not feeling like you're in a tin can.
Yeah, when you first get ashore, like immediately, I come home and my wife's like, all your laundry in the put it all in the laundry now because you smell like boat. You're gonna make the whole house smell like boat. And I'm immediately, I want fresh fruits and vegetables. Like I'll
Yeah.
just like, let's give me salad, give me a fresh salad whenever I come home, because after you've been underway for a little while, the first thing to go is the fruits and vegetables, and then you're on frozen stuff, and then
Sure.
pretty soon thereafter, the eggs get replaced with powdered eggs, and then you're eventually everything's either frozen or canned, and then the food gets weirder from there. you know, and then don't get me wrong, the food's normally pretty good as long as you've got enough on board, but
Sure.
the first thing I want when I come back is fruits and vegetables.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about your book. So your book, Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy, right? And tell us about first off, tell us about the book and tell us a little bit about kind of how you incorporated some of your experiences from your naval career and how that maybe influenced the book and kind of what the book's all about.
Yeah. So that's probably what I think your listeners will be most interested in is I guarantee some of them have heard of Stoicism because it's trending right now.
Sure.
But if anyone ever tells you, hey, I was into Stoicism before it was cool, step back a little bit, because that person might be a vampire, because it's 2,000 years old. It's a philosophy that came from the same era of time as Aristotle and Plato and all those old Greek, Hellenistic schools, like the Cynics and the Platonics and Epicureans, all those guys. The Stoics were a very important school from that period of time, and they kind of faded away as the Athens like philosophical scene dissolved, and then they blew up again in Rome a few hundred years later. And it's from that period that we have a lot of writings that we take away and can look back and say, like, okay, that was Stoic thinking. The most famous of those is Marcus Aurelius, who was the emperor of Rome. in the beginning of the movie Gladiator. He's there, and then there's another couple of them that I'm a big fan of. So this philosophy is kind of blown up right now for a variety of reasons we can get into. And so if you haven't heard of it, you should just be aware of it, because you'll see it around, and you'll see, blogs and, booksellers and stuff like that promoting it. But the basic idea of the philosophy is it has to do a lot with how to think about things and how I receive information and how I should handle the situations that I experience, such that I have better control of my emotions and self and willpower and all those things. And it's all those things that are particularly valuable in a warrior, or, I use that word to mean a military professional. And so the basic contention of the book is that, insofar as any discrete mode of thinking might be considered a warrior philosophy, Stoicism is it. And it basically is an optimal philosophy, or an optimal way of thinking for a military person. It's the closest thing that you're going to find on planet Earth in reality to like the Jedi religion or something like that. Only the difference is it's real,
Sure.
and it's not laser swords. It's the real thing, and it's genuine and effective mechanisms for emotional control and self-discipline that are a lot of people are finding very valuable today. I think it's blowing up mainly as a kind of reaction to the mental health crisis that we're experiencing right now, where basically the external environment that we're all in right now, the social media, the news media, all those things they kind of militate against mental health. You have a lot of pressures that weren't necessarily as salient, 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, as they are now, that are basically acting against mental health and requiring something different than what we've had before to cope with it. And people find, for very good reasons we can get into, that Stoicism is helping them to have more mental health, or to be, healthier from a mental standpoint.
Well, and it's one of those things that, like you said, it's kind of lasted for thousands of years, where this is something that has gone through different cultures, different civilizations, different groups of people who are experiencing their own set of unique circumstances that were maybe difficult, new situations that they had to deal with. And social media certainly is a relatively new phenomena that, it's only within the last, 20-ish years that social media even was really a thing, the way that we experience it now. So yeah, we still have to kind of figure out how do we live with this? How do we use this? And, it has its purposes and stuff, but yeah, it doesn't always contribute to the best overall mental health for the users of it. So it kind of makes sense that we would look back to something that's thousands of years old to say, hey, help me work through this new situation, right?
Well, what's very interesting about the Stoicism thing that I think is kind of undersold and isn't really talked about that much, is the interplay it has with therapy and psychotherapy, and the degree to which it has been influential on what today we call psychotherapy. So, if I have a sailor who's not adapting, and we have to send him, to the medical system, he's going to be assessed, and it's determined that he needs some kind of therapy. The regimen, and this is going to be the case if you go to any counselor, you're going to go through a regimen called cognitive behavioral therapy. And that is what you think of as, talk therapy, where you're talking through your problems and saying, why did you think that? Okay, let's get at the underlying belief that supports that emotion. Let's call out the emotion as what it is. Let's identify it, and let's determine if that's a rational thing or not. Well, the people who like that mode of therapy was really developed in like the 1950s. It's very young. There's, between cognitive behavioral therapy and rational emotive behavioral therapy, there are these different modes of psychotherapy that kind of all emerged in that same period of time. Well, the guys from which they emerged, the guys who basically thought up these things, and therapy is a little bit older than that, but what we now know is cognitive behavioral therapy. these guys were deeply read in philosophy, specifically the Stoics. And you can find it in their writings as they're developing it, that they say that they're adapting practices that they took from specifically Stoic philosophers, that and the ways that the Stoics would see the world, and basically promote the patterns of thought and the habits of thought of, you know, mental health, of identifying why I think the thing I think, why I feel what I feel, and getting and isolating the underlying judgment that is causing that emotion, and neutralizing it. And that's kind of why, and the Stoics have a reputation, and why the word Stoic is often used as synonymous for unemotional, and they didn't believe in just suppressing all emotions, just the bad ones. And that's not necessarily the negative or unpleasant ones. That's just the ones that are any emotion that follows from an irrational judgment. And for them, they would consider almost anything that didn't have some kind of bearing on my duty or my virtue, to be an irrational judgment, such as, somebody insults me, or cuts me off in traffic or whatever. And if I'm angry, it's because I have this judgment that I've been harmed in some way. Whenever I really look at the situation, I really understand it. I know that I have not been harmed. It's not that person that has made me angry. It's me that's made me angry. It's my judgment. It's internal to me. And in that way, it is a kind of radical view of personal responsibility. I am not just responsible for what I do. I am also responsible for what's going on in my head right now. And that a lot of people don't like that, but it turns out that it is a very effective way of thinking about things. Even if you find it impossible to absolutely control what you can do, or what you're thinking, recognizing that, it is certainly more my responsibility than it is anyone else's. That's the first step to getting over it and figuring it out. And that's a healthy way of thinking. So those practices that therapists will teach you as part of a regimen, as mitigators, as, interventions, or whatever technical term they want to give them, the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, considered those just how you should think about things. It was just
Sure.
a natural way of thinking. And it's not to say that the old philosophers were really like they had just discovered cognitive behavioral therapy, and all, modern therapists are just doing Stoicism. It's not that. It's more like we understood winemaking long before anyone had invented a microscope, and understood what fermentation was actually doing, what was actually happening there. They just knew it worked. Or old Indians figured out that you could chew on the bark of a willow tree and cure a headache, before anyone understood that the active ingredient of that willow bark was salicylic acid, which can be isolated and synthesized as aspirin. So
Sure.
it's like a natural thing that worked thousands of years ago, before anyone really understood how it worked. It just applies to the mental space instead of the physical space.
Sure. Yeah, and that makes sense too, because a lot of things, I mean, when the first caveman invented fire, he didn't understand the whole science behind the fire coming to be. It just
Yeah, I didn't need
was
to.
I don't really care if I'm cold and I need fire, or something. I know that it works, and that's all I really care about at that point, right? It's only kind of later on when people start to get curious, like, okay, why does this work, or how does this work, and you start asking those types of questions. So,
Yeah.
so it's interesting that thousands of years ago we people had these philosophies that still apply today, and you look at a lot of kind of old writings and stuff, and they have just as much applicability to our daily lives today as they did before the internet, before running water, before electricity, and all these other modern conveniences that we might think, oh, we're such an advanced. We're not really any different than people were back then. We just, technology has changed. Really, it's kind of like the biggest difference, I think, between us
Yeah,
now and then.
man, you nailed it. So like this is the same reason that we still read Shakespeare in high
Yeah.
school. Okay. It's survivorship bias. The stuff that we are still reading from a long time ago, the reason we're still reading it and still studying it is because it cuts to the core of what it means to be a human being on planet Earth. And that's not necessarily true for everything from that time. And this is called survivorship bias. It's the same thing that applies. It's the same reason that we still listen to, classic rock, and we say, man, the old music is so much better than the crap that's, being put out today. It's not that there wasn't crap back then. It's that the stuff that we still listen to from back then is the best stuff. And
Sure.
the same thing can be said of literature from, the Middle Ages, and the same thing can be said of philosophy from ancient times. There's a lot of crappy philosophy today, and there was a lot of crappy philosophy back then. We're not talking about the crappy stuff. We're talking about the very best ideas because they're always relevant. And that's kind of part of the reason I don't like to talk about like current events, because it's not going to be relevant tomorrow, much less next year. But I like to talk about ideas that were relevant 2,000 years ago, and they're going to still be important 2,000 years from now, and true about what it means to be a human being on planet Earth.
Yeah, and so taking this mindset, this Stoicism, and the philosophy that goes along with it, the warrior philosophy that as your book title kind of labels it, how do you think someone who might pick up this book and read it, how do you think that it can apply to their daily life? What, especially the veterans who might be listening, what are some of the key lessons that you think that they can take from it and really apply to their lives?
Okay, so the first thing I will say is that the book is like absolutely not for everyone. All right, it's a pretty nerdy book. It's pretty much it's for somebody who is already decently familiar with Stoicism and is excited about it and wants to know more and wants to get deeper into it. If someone in your audience is like, oh, that philosophy sounds interesting, but I haven't really read on it, what I would really recommend for them is the book How to Think Like a Roman Emperor by Donald Robertson. He's a friend of mine, and his writing is very good and very accessible, and it's a good introduction, and it's just an excellent book. And from there, you can read you can read any of the ancient Stoic stuff. It's all over the internet. The problem with it is that you've got a lot of yokels who will put out a blog every other day of how Stoicism leads you to, if you really read the Stoics, you would agree with me about all these political things, and you've just got that you've got all that kind of silliness.
Sure.
That goes in every direction. So I'd rather just read the original guys and then think about like, well, do I agree with that or not? And that's kind of how you should approach philosophy. You don't approach it like a religion where you say, okay, I believe all these things. Now, what do I believe? You say, okay, well, let me engage with this idea. And if I don't agree with it, I'm like, well, I think he's wrong about that, because he's a human being, he's immortal. Like who cares? They're not magic,
Sure.
So, but with all that said, to answer your question, so the how someone might apply my book, the kind of people the book's for is if you want to know how the Stoic philosophy, first of all, like you want to get deeply into it and see what did they actually say, especially how does that apply to the morality of a warrior? How does that get into, would a good person truly go to war and be willing to, pick up a rifle and attack my fellow man? And I argue that under certain conditions, absolutely that's true. And, under certain conditions, it would be the wrong thing to refuse to do that.
Sure.
And, exploring all the morality of that, and that's an ancient tradition of philosophy known as just war theory. What are the conditions under which a good country goes to war, and what are the conditions under which a good individual goes to war, and how does he conduct himself in that environment? That's all just war theory. And basically some of the book looks at the questions of just war through the lens of Stoic morality. How would the Stoics look at these same questions? So that is basically who might derive value from it. If someone's trying to think through the morality of perhaps something that they've experienced, something that they witnessed, or something that they did or were a part of, and are interested in the questions of like, hey, was that a really screwed up thing I was a part of, and how responsible am I for that? I can't, no human being can answer that question, but you can possibly see a lot of different ways of looking at it and ways of thinking about it and arrive at a more developed and more mature answer. And that, I think that would be helpful to some people.
Yeah, and so what I'm getting from this is sort of like the, kind of on a macro scale, the almost a justification for going to war and sending troops into battle and things like that can be kind of derived from some of these principles. Like, is it the right thing to do in this circumstance to go and send troops off to war? And like you said, in some cases, absolutely yes, that's going to be true. It is the right thing to do. In some cases, no, it's not. And doing so might actually be, considered the maybe an immoral thing to do, or just, the not right thing to do. But then when you kind of distill that down, take that out of a military context and just, look at your day-to-day life. You had mentioned an example before of someone cutting you off in traffic, or something like that. Those are kind of, a smaller scale argument, or something like that. Are you justified in taking some action, or responding harshly in a certain kind of way if this set of circumstances happen, or a different set of circumstances happen, and maybe you're not justified in responding in that same way. You can't act as if someone's out to get you every second of the day. You kind of have to take each situation for what it is, and its own unique set of circumstances and facts that surround it, and use those to kind of make a determination of what the right course of action is. That kind of the gist of it.
That's definitely part of it. So,
Okay.
you talked about how I can't go through life thinking people are out to get me. I'd say absolutely. There's nothing more antithetical to Stoicism than victimhood.
Sure.
And you can find people who read the Stoics and say like, well, they would be completely, if you really read the Stoics like I have, you would see that they would be totally left wing. And other people would say, well, if you really read the Stoics like I do, you could see that they'd be totally right wing. And so obviously there's a lot of room for reasonable disagreement between, reasonable people there.
Sure.
But what both sides must agree on is that if you read the Stoics and if you agree with them, then you're not going to be a victim. And if you take the most egregious stuff that's coming out on the left or the coming out on the right, and you just filter it out and filter all grievance and victimhood out of it, what's left is a lot of just reasonable discourse.
Sure.
Basically
Sure.
filtering out all that victimhood and all that grievance and all that anger that comes with it, and righteous indignation that comes with it. That's all the worst crap that is in politics right now, and that's in disagreement. And what you have is just reasonable people with reasonable positions that can now negotiate. Okay.
Sure.
And so what I kind of say about Stoicism, as applied to like, the social or political questions, is that it's not necessarily left coded or right coded, but it is necessarily anti-radicalizing. It is an anti-radicalizing force. And so for that reason, I think it's a very good thing, and something that, we can all benefit from applying these ideas and just figuring out how to neutralize the grievance and the victimhood. One of the concepts that I kind of introduce in the book is I recognize, kind of studying how the Stoics deal with these things that we can't necessarily control even within ourselves. And I find that it analogizes to the responsibility that a military commander has, and to act as if they have absolute control over things that in all rationality they don't. And so if I were to put a name to that, I would call it the responsibility heuristic, which is, a heuristic is like a thumb rule or a simplifying assumption, a way of dealing with something to quickly, condense a concept to actionable results. And so the responsibility heuristic is basically capturing the idea that outcomes are going to be better. In whatever my situation, outcomes are going to be improved if I act as if I have absolute control over the situation, even knowing that I don't. So it's like you'll hear it. People say, "Hey, life's like a game of cards. It's not the hand you're dealt. It's it's how you play the hand." And what responsibility heuristic does not mean is that you legitimately think that the hand that you're dealt doesn't matter. What the responsibility heuristic captures is that, you're going to get dealt a hand that's going to statistically affect your odds of winning or losing, but that doesn't matter. There's nothing you can do about that. What does matter is how you play the hand, and you focus all of your energies and control on that, and stop crying about what hand you were dealt. You focus completely on how you play it, and then play it well. And that's kind of what that captures. And it's just, that's similar to the way a ship captain, or any other commander of any unit, but I use a ship captain as just, that's what's readily on my mind. I can be, if my, I can, have no control over the fact that my fathometer operator just decides to gaff off on his watch and falls asleep, and now my ship runs aground, and I'm absolutely fired for that, because, and we can say, well, in that case, I fostered a culture of lax standards that allowed that to happen, and all those things. But ultimately, like, no matter what, there's going to be things that are outside of my control. But I have, in either event, I have absolute responsibility over that situation, and outcomes are going to be the better if I act as if I have absolute responsibility over that situation. And I assume responsibility for the fact that fathometer operator fell asleep, and that's kind of what that captures. And I find that sense kind of running through the philosophy.
Yeah. So when you are kind of eliminating that whole victimhood mindset and taking responsibility for things, even though you aren't necessarily able to control it yourself, but you still take responsibility for those things, kind of like the ship captain that you just mentioned there. But there are things that you can take responsibility for, just in a family situation. If you have kids, is it directly your fault if your kid goes and does something wrong? Like, no,
that's such a great example.
But you could teach them right from wrong beforehand and hopefully prevent that from happening, right? They have free will. They can go do what they're going to do with that. But teaching them right from wrong and why doing the right thing is better than the wrong thing, that's kind of on you as a parent to be your responsibility, right?
Yeah, and any parent knows that you can do everything right, and that kid can just still go off and do something completely ridiculous and develop in some way that you would not have chosen.
Sure.
And despite whatever you've done, and they're the quintessential example of just little balls of chaos that you're absolutely responsible for. And yet, I think you have to have more than one kid to really appreciate just how little control you have over it. Because, whenever it was my first, I'm questioning myself, like, what am I doing wrong? Like, I'm doing everything right. Why is this baby not acting this way? And once I had more than one, I see how different the brothers are, even though they're raised the same. They're just completely different personalities from another. I'm like, oh, you're an individual.
Right. Yeah, you're going to respond to different things differently, and so even like you said, even if they're raised in identical manners, everything is the same, they may not respond to those things all the same way, and so you might have to adjust things and everything, but that's taking that responsibility and saying, okay, what do I need to do differently to lead this kid in the right direction? And there's that piece of it, but when you are taking responsibility, when you are understanding that not everything is under your control, you take responsibility for the things that you should be taking responsibility, but understanding that you can't control everything. You can't control all of the outcomes, no matter what you do. You can do everything right. Like, you can get all the parenting books and you can do all the right things, and assuming that all the parenting books agree, let's just put that out there for now. But you could do all the right things and your kid could still grow up and not be potentially a good person. I'm not saying that in anyone's particular case, but that's just maybe their personality or something that has kind of affected them and in a certain way that they end up being something that you kind of wish that they weren't, maybe. And that's out of your control. And kind of being okay with the things that are out of your control and not getting too bent out of shape about the things that you can't control, and focus on the things that you can control, but not worried too much about the things that are outside of your control, right?
The truth is that almost nothing is truly within my control. I
Sure.
can study for the test, and yet the schoolhouse might burn down with me inside of it.
Yeah, right.
Like there are so few things that you absolutely can control, and that is a huge piece of the Stoic philosophy. And the use of the word control triggers some philosophy nerds, and they say, well, that's not really the word they use. The real phrase they used is what is up to us and what is not. The key concept is that what and really the key part, the keystone concept of the Stoic philosophy is that virtue is what matters. Virtue is the sole good, as is the phrase that they would use. And basically nothing else is truly good but virtue. And then everything else follows from that idea of the way that they view the world. And so the whole control thing comes into play in assessing what is truly related to virtue or not. So, if I get angry at, the fact that someone did something that angers me, whatever they did has no reflection on my virtue, I shouldn't care about it. It's neutral. It's a indifferent matter. But how I react to that thing, that does reflect on my virtue. That is an expression of my virtue as an individual. And so that looking at everything through that lens, it's not necessarily about just focusing on what I can control and what I can't. It's using that dividing line, recognizing what is up to me and what is not up to me as the dividing line between what is a moral factor and what is a non-moral factor. And those non-moral factors are truly irrelevant. Even health and wealth and all those things. Like I can do everything right and I can still get cancer. I can go running and diet and still get sick. I can save all my money and still get wiped out, and still become unemployed, whatever. Like I can do everything right and still all these things can go against me, but they're all ultimately material things that, what truly matters within the Stoic worldview is my virtue and how I react to those things that are outside of my control. And that's kind of how that plays into the philosophy.
Yeah. And I think going back to the mental health stuff that we were talking about earlier, that can have a huge impact on somebody's, overall mental health, because a lot of times, again, there's that victim mindset, which doesn't,
It's toxic.
That's toxic. That doesn't help anything. It doesn't help anyone or anything. And it's just not going to benefit you in any way. But also like not being so concerned with the things that are outside of your control. Of course, you care about certain things, like, what your kids do and how they are growing up and all that kind of stuff. You care about that stuff. But, ultimately, like you said, they're individuals and they're going to go off and do the things that they're going to do. And I'm not saying just completely be negligent and don't care about them at all. But, at some point you kind of have to not get too bent out of shape when there's those things that are outside of your control, and trying to be too controlling might actually have the opposite effect, where it kind of pushes them in a different direction, kind of in spite of what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah, there's something appropriate that I should do as a father.
Yeah.
Attendant to my role as a father, there are appropriate actions
Right.
that I should take and ways I should interact. But I shouldn't anguish about things going a way that I would not have chosen for them to going. I shouldn't wail about it or rage about it. Unless I reasonably say, like, I should express anger in this situation because that's going to be the most effective way to communicate the lesson I need to communicate. Like that,
Sure.
that you could argue that point. The ancient Stoics basically denied that, but we're reasonable people and we could say, like, well, no, there are times where maybe it would be appropriate to express anger, just as long as I'm not internally actually losing control.
Right. Sure.
And then that's just a reasonable way you can approach things, because we think like philosophers. We engage with the ideas and we're willing to say that our teachers are wrong. Like that's an important piece. But back to the parenting thing, I've got responsibilities as a father, and that's a role, that's a key role that I have to play. And I have responsibilities as a naval officer, and that's a different key role I've got to play. Where I'm really gonna find alignment and find peace is being able to select the roles that I can and attend to the roles that I can't, in such a way that they are in alignment and in harmony to the extent that I can. And I find that my role as a naval officer, if I'm doing that right, it supports my role as a father. It doesn't contradict it. Likewise, my role as a father, if I do that role well, it supports my responsibilities to being a naval officer. Now if I had the job of being that guy that calls little old ladies and cons them out of their life insurance or whatever, like that, I'm probably not going to be able to harmonize that role with any of the other roles that I play. So maybe I should just cut that role loose and find a better job.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and yeah, those people should definitely find a better job, because those are kind of like the scum of the earth.
But kind of my point there is that by looking at it through that view of saying like, okay, how does this role harmonize with this other one, and does it, is kind of a test for like, is this a legitimate role I should even accept, or is it
right.
one that I should reject and walk away from?
Right. And I guess going back to what you were talking about, and kind of understanding, your own virtues and your own kind of makeup and like who you are,
Mm.
does that fit with your values and your beliefs, and what makes you you? If you're kind of contradicting yourself, and it's like, no, I would never do those kind of bad things to little old ladies, but then you have a job that you're calling them up and conning them out of their life insurance money. Well, you're going to have some internal conflict there, right? You're not going to be too happy with yourself.
You're deceiving yourself if you're not. If you're telling
Right.
yourself, I feel good about this, like, okay, you're lying to yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You're something as a human. That appeal to coherence is kind of an ancient test that I find applications for it every day in the old philosophers back in the age of when the Stoics and all these guys were arguing in Athens. What they would do is try to attack each other's philosophies and say, you see, your philosophy is wrong because it's incoherent in this way. You say this, but you also say this, and those two things can't be true at the same time. Those two things that you say, those two claims are in disagreement. They're in misalignment. And so that appeal to coherency is like a test of the validity of a worldview, but it's best expressed in the coherency of thought and deed. And like, do the things that you say and the things that you do and the things that you think all agree with one another? That's living with integrity. That's what integrity is. And if you are not living with integrity, you're going to be internally screwed up. You're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to contain some kind of internal dissonance. So
Sure.
kind of the way I like to express Stoicism, if I'm trying to, say what the heck is it really fast, I say it's an intersection point between hyper rationality and virtue ethics. It basically brings rationality and virtue into alignment. Because some people might think, well, I am totally rational, and that gives me the ability to be a total Machiavellian bastard and just go around and take advantage of people and con them out of things because I, with my rational mind, I see that they're just worms and not worth my time, or my consideration. And that's a philosophical worldview says like, okay, you're kidding yourself there, buddy.
Right.
You're in complete misalignment with all these other values that you purport to have. And if you look at it hard enough, if you look at it from a wide enough view, you will see that that view misaligns with 100 other views that I guarantee you that you claim to hold. And
Sure.
and so that appeal to coherency is a good way of kind of testing, am I living my life like I should? And am I thinking like I should? And if I am doing those things, then I'm going to be a happier person and a more effective person, which are in alignment.
Right. And I think that's ultimately the goal, with especially a lot of the stuff that we were talking about with the mental health stuff and all the things that people are going through. You want to end up living a happier, more well-rounded kind of life. And ultimately, from some of the stuff that you're talking about, to me, it's like you can take some of the things that you're going through. Just take that example of someone cutting you off in traffic. Take your goal for being in that car at that moment in that place on the highway or wherever you are. What is your goal? Is your goal getting to work, getting to your kid's soccer practice, or whatever it is that you're trying to do? That's your goal. And does the anger at that person who is going to drive away and go about their day anyways, and you're never going to see that person again, is getting angry at that person going to help you achieve that goal?
No.
And if it's not, then why do it?
Yeah.
Like, who cares? Let it go and move on. Not to be a doormat and just be walked all over and things like that. That's not what I'm saying. But at some point you have to look at it and say, is any of this stuff helping me achieve what I'm trying to achieve here? And if it's not, and also it's in congruence with your values and beliefs and things, we'll just assume that everything here is, if it's not, then it's almost like just let it go and move on, and don't devote any more mental energy to it, right?
Yeah, if you can isolate what the belief is that's leading you to become angry.
Sure.
Some people will say, one of the things I'll get is like, "Hey, isn't anger helpful to, like maybe motivate action?"
Mm-hmm.
And I can argue it either way, but I can say, well, what the Stoics would say, what these particular philosophers that I write about would say, is that it would be better to be motivated to do those things without the emotional,
Okay.
confusion, without the contribution of this thing that's likely to, this kind of drug that's likely to make me do something that's otherwise other from what I should absolutely do. A good way to think about it is if I'm a prize fighter, same a boxer, would I rather be the guy that gets pissed off, like that's going to make me fight better, or would I rather be the cold and calculating robot that gets the other guy pissed off so that I can crush him? Like which one of those guys do I want to be?
Mm.
And then that as a warfighter, I'm a submarine guy, and so if I'm in a tactical engagement, is being pissed off gonna make it easier for me to isolate the guy's frequency vulnerabilities and triangulate a firing solution on this guy? Like, no, that's not going to help.
Right. Exactly.
You know?
I think you should probably talk to some of my drill sergeants that I had, and
Well, so you make a good point. All right. So like, especially like a leadership situation,
sure.
like if I have a sailor that, says something racist,
Sure.
or cuts a corner in electrical safety and something risks his life or the life of his shipmate, that's a situation where I better light this person up like right now. But what would be best is if I, and that's, let's be very clear, that's a very, very rare situation.
Right.
And, being going around yelling and stuff like that, like that's grotesquely informal, usually should not be done around people operating dangerous machines, like warships,
Mm-hmm.
but if if I need to communicate, if I need to express this emotion to communicate most effectively in a moment, then okay, maybe that is the most efficient and effective way to do it. But it would be better if I can do that without internalizing those emotions. If I can do that
Okay.
thinking rationally internally of like, okay, this is the right thing to do at this time for this reason. And I will, I will immediately go back to my stateroom and I'll be cool and calm and collected and not bite the head off of the next person that comes and talks to me. Like that would be the ideal scenario that an ideal human would be able to do. Now, am I going to be able to do that as a limited human being? Probably not, but recognizing the ideal is going to be helpful to get me quickly back up to speed of where I should be and how I should be operating.
Right. Right. This is a rather complex topic. I mean, it's got a lot of meat to it. You even said, that your book Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy is it's a deep book, and you kind of need to have some basis in Stoicism, some general understanding of it before diving into that. You don't want to jump into the deep end without knowing how to swim, right? So it's it is a complicated topic, and but just from this conversation, I can already see the ways that people can start applying some of these philosophies to their day-to-day life. Things, reacting in a rational, I don't want to say unemotional way, but in a rational way, given the set of circumstances, not blowing up at every little thing. I know a lot of times people will, especially veterans who have, maybe it's PTSD or they're dealing with, certain types of issues, they may just blow up at the smallest things. And it, again, does that serve whatever your goal is? No, probably not. Um, and and so, using some of these philosophies and really thinking about what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it and how that's affecting you and the people around you. And, it all kind of comes together when you really slow down and start to think about what's going on. And, so I feel like this is, while it is a extremely complex subject, it can kind of be boiled down to something as simple as that. But I'm sure there's a lot of nuance to it as well, right?
Yeah. So, a lot of people will complain about all the popularizers and the guys that write a lot on this, that write kind of shallow stuff, and like, oh, you're dumbing it down to a bumper sticker version. Well, like maybe there's some value in that bumper sticker version, and
Right.
there's more meat on the bone if you want to get to it.
Sure.
So, um, yeah, so the a practice that I would recommend for the veterans that are listening to this, if they're just like not philosophical at all, or like, I don't know what this, nerd's talking about over here, just try this. Try journaling. And that is a practice that it's ancient, and it's in fact the reason that we have the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and the reason that most of us even, that he's famous enough that he's a household name, is because those were a philosophical exercise for him that he was performing as part of his drills, his routines of just like, let me write down my thoughts, write down what's bothering me, and criticize, this is how I reacted to this situation, and I wish I hadn't.
Yeah, sure.
And that's, or this is happening. He's pretty hard on himself, but that exercise of just thinking through how your day went, what you did, and why you think the things that you think, try to write it down, and you will find out that you often think things that you didn't necessarily realize you thought, or you will uncover ways in which you're being incoherent, of like, oh, I think this, but I also think that, and that is obviously incompatible. One of those ideas is wrong, and there are a lot of things that you will think you think until you try to write it down, and then you realize it's just a jumble of feelings, and there's not really a coherent thought there, because you can't put it on paper. It's just a jumble of emotions. And that exercise is ancient, and it's what any therapist will tell you to do, and it's free. It costs as much as a little notebook down at the drugstore, and no one has to read it. You just get in the routine of doing it every night or every morning or whatever, and that, spend 30 minutes doing that can work wonders for mental health, I think. And that is an ancient philosophical practice.
Yeah, and that's actually great advice. And I think one of the benefits to writing something down as opposed to, oh, I'll just use my phone, I'll record a voice note or something like that.
Nope.
One of the benefits of physically writing it down, pen to paper type of writing it down, even better than typing it on a keyboard or whatever, but physically writing it, is you slow down when you write. You can't write as fast as you can think or speak. And so when you do that, your brain gets to kind of jump ahead and think of that next thing as you're writing down the current thing, and kind of process some of the other stuff that you're going through, and you get a little bit deeper thoughts on whatever it is that you're journaling about. Then and I've experienced this myself through various therapy that I've gone through, and that was one of the, like you said, that was one of the things that they suggested that I do. And so I started writing things down, and I started thinking about things and remembering things, feelings, emotions, all these things that were taking place that I completely forgot about. But that's because I usually would just think about it real quick, and then I'd be on to the next thing. Whereas this, I slowed down, and it took me a lot longer to think through something when I was physically writing it down. And that to
The
me,
that point is a really good one, and like I hadn't thought of that.
okay,
And it's very useful to me that you say that. Like because I've gotten in the habit of typing journaling, and I'm like, man, I can get through a lot stuff a lot faster. But maybe that's kind of beside the point.
sure,
The being forced to slow down and engage with it differently.
yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's something that I noticed. It was like a strange phenomenon that happened when I was doing this. I was physically writing, on a piece of paper, and it to me, I was just like, I can't believe that it worked in that way, just by slowing down and writing. And so, for folks out there who are maybe just, I don't know, struggling with whatever it is that they're going through, write it down and just journal it, and maybe that'll help you kind of think through it and work your way through it. It may not be for everybody, but it's, hey, if you've tried everything and you haven't tried this, you haven't tried it all yet. So give it a shot and see if it maybe works and it's maybe helpful for you. And it may be in combination with something else too, but that might be, like you said, that might be beneficial, just to start journaling and make it a habit, not just
Yeah.
I'll just do it tonight, and that didn't do anything for me, so whatever, I'm never going to do it again. Like, give it a real shot.
You need the routine.
Exactly.
Yeah, just do it. Just do it.
Yeah, suck it up and do it. Go get the notebook and some pens and just actually do it. Well, this has been a great conversation. Tell us again, like the book, where people can find it, and all that kind of stuff, and where they can go to find out more information, if there's any place that you want to send them to.
Yeah, sure. The book is called Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy. I am the author, William C. Spears. It's the first book I've ever written. I hope that it's not the last, but I make my money being an active duty Navy officer, so it might be a while before I can get to another one. You can find the book. It's sold at, Barnes and Noble. It's on Amazon. Wherever you get books. I also have a website, williamcspears.com. I just use that as a place to hang essays and stuff like that. So if you really want to like read my thoughts on, why we should build nuclear powered surface ships, or, why the Navy should have the B-1 bomber, something like, boring military stuff like that, then you can go to my website and read some of my war nerd articles.
Yeah, I don't know how boring that sounds. That actually sounds pretty cool. So I might be checking that out. So, and I'll have links to all this in the show notes for folks as well, because I know folks listening, they may not be able to write everything down in the moment. So they'll have all the links to your website. I'll put a link to the book, and anything else that we might have mentioned in this episode. I'll try to drop some links into the show notes for the listeners.
Okay.
Excellent.
Let me leave your listeners with one last thing.
Yeah, sure.
It's kind of the point that, to get back to the appeal to coherency. So kind of the original philosopher that's kind of like the granddaddy of Stoicism is this little guy named Socrates, you might have heard of. So Socrates doing the Socrates thing of asking these just impossible questions that he would, one of the things that he tried to get at was, what is good? What makes an act good? And he concluded that an act is good if it is both honorable and useful. Mm-hmm. And hundreds of years later, this guy named Cicero is probably one of my favorite philosophers. He's actually not a Stoic, but he is adjacent to the Stoics, and he admires them, and a lot of his personal philosophy reflects the Stoics that he was writing, and he's kind of our source for a lot of stuff. He's also incidentally a very important political philosopher, very influential on the founding fathers of the United States. But anyway, Cicero took that idea from Socrates and said, okay, well, Socrates said that which is honorable and useful is good, but we can infer from that which is truly honorable must be useful, and that which is truly useful must be honorable. And conversely, if it is not truly honorable, then it is not truly useful, no matter how expedient it may seem to be in the moment. That to me, most beautifully out of kind of any other quote that I can find. That wasn't the actual quote, but you got the sentiment of it.
Sure.
in there. It captures the appeal to coherency and the idea that if I am, getting ahead in some superficial way by something that is not honorable, then I recognize immediately that is not truly useful. That's going to bite me in the ass in some way. I'm going to regret that decision in some way. Whatever I am getting out of that, it is not truly good. It is something other than good. And that, I think, is just a very useful way of looking at life and capturing all that in a pithy statement. So I'll leave you with that.
Excellent. Well, I do appreciate you coming on, sharing, first off, your service and, kind of your background on the submarines and everything. I think that's pretty cool. I don't usually get to talk to folks who serve on submarines, so it's kind of cool to hear a little bit about that. But also all the, the work that you've done with your book and Stoicism and everything. It's an interesting philosophy, and I think, as people kind of get turned on to it a little bit more, they will, hopefully make some improvements in their lives, whether it's their mental health or other areas of their lives that they are kind of working on. I think it just in general, it'll help them just make those improvements that they've been looking to make. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing what you did with us. And, yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, Scott, I really appreciate it. This has been great.